After the tragic deaths of the Gordians in distant Africa and the crushing collapse of their audacious revolt against Maximinus Thrax in April 238 CE, the Roman Senate found itself in a truly desperate and precarious position. Having once dared to declare Emperor Maximinus an enemy of the people, it now faced the terrifying prospect of an imminent and brutal invasion of Italy by his armies. The very fate of the Republic hung in the balance, and the emperors the Senate had so recently elevated had already vanished into oblivion, leaving behind a dangerous and frightening void that demanded immediate filling. When news of Gordian's untimely demise reached the heart of Rome, both the venerable Senate and the alarmed populace were utterly bewildered and stunned, as their hopes for this ruler had collapsed in an instant. In that hour of deep despair, with Maximinus' shadow looming over the eternal city, the Senate, desperately seeking someone who could serve as a reliable shield against the approaching threat, acted with extraordinary speed and resolve. 20 of its most respected and wisest members were chosen and tasked with taking the reins of the empire at this critical moment and, most importantly, electing a new emperor. These distinguished men were selected for their unrivaled age and undeniable service to Rome, and their appointment was solemnly approved by a general vote. Although other senators also received votes in this momentous process, the final count revealed two co-rulers, Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus and Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus, were jointly elevated to the imperial throne. The idea of electing two emperors, intended to restrain and balance each other, much like the ancient consuls, and to share the immense burden of imperial rule, seemed, at first glance, quite sound and far-sighted. However, what was meant to be a model of harmonious cooperation turned out to be quite different. Instead of uniting their efforts for the salvation of Rome, these two powerful men immediately engaged in bitter quarrels over the most trivial matters, creating a highly precarious situation for the empire's future. In some official inscriptions, Pupienus' name was mentioned first, which caused noticeable dissatisfaction for his colleague, who insisted on his more distinguished aristocratic lineage. Unfortunately, very little information has survived about these two senatorial emperors. However, it is known that Pupienus was born around 168 CE and began his ascension through the ranks as a centurion primipolius before serving as a military tribune and praetor. His state career appears to have been quite impressive. Pupienus held a number of significant posts during the reign of the Severan dynasty, and immediately before these events, he held the responsible position of urban prefect. Balbinus was born around 178 CE. He had the honor of serving as consul twice, first as a suffect consul, and a second time in 213 CE, holding the position of ordinary consul jointly with Emperor Caracalla himself. This circumstance eloquently testified to his favor with the reigning monarch. Meanwhile, the populace and the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard actively expressed their support for the 13-year-old Marcus Antonius Gordianus, who was the nephew of Gordian II. In response, the Senate granted the young Gordian the title of Caesar, thereby officially recognizing his designation as the future successor to the two senatorial emperors. Balbinus, who was about 60 years old, and Pupienus, who had reached the age of 70, at the time of their elevation to the imperial throne, already foreshadowed their brief reign. Indeed, as expected, Pupienus and Balbinus held the reins of power for only 99 days. Nevertheless, during this exceptionally short period, the Roman mint showed astonishing productivity, issuing 29 different types of coins for Pupienus and 23 for Balbinus. Ironically, despite the deep mutual animosity between the two co-emperors, the reverse of many of these coins featured an image of clasped hands with the inscription, "Mutual Trust of the Emperors." This, of course, was nothing more than blatant self-deception. However, given the widespread appearance of this symbol on all coins, it can be assumed that its use was the result of their prior agreement at the very beginning of their joint rule. At the same time, Maximinus Thrax, driven by an insatiable thirst for vengeance against the Senate and an unwavering determination to restore his status as the sole emperor of Rome, rapidly advanced towards Italy and the Eternal City. Since Pupienus possessed significantly more military experience than his co-ruler, he was entrusted with leading the northern campaign to repel Maximinus, who was at that moment besieging Aquileia. Balbinus was to remain in Rome, responsible for managing the empire's civil affairs. Unrest in Rome. In March 238 CE, the residents of Rome customarily flocked to the Senate building, eager to learn about the progress of state affairs. On that fateful day, 2 veteran praetorians, dressed in civilian clothes, displayed perhaps excessive curiosity. They entered the Senate, where they met immediate death at the hand of Senator Gallicanus, who skillfully concealed a dagger. When their fellow praetorians witnessed this tragic sight, they were seized with genuine terror for their own safety. Unarmed and intimidated by the size of the enraged crowd, they hastily turned and fled. Gallicanus, rushing out of the Senate building, triumphantly brandished the bloody dagger in his hand, urging the crowd to pursue and destroy the enemies of the Senate and all the Roman people. The populace, with surprising ease, succumbed to his fiery rhetoric, cheering Gallicanus loudly, and rushed after the praetorians, hurling stones at them. The retreating praetorians eventually reached their camp, where they immediately locked the gates, armed themselves, and posted guards on the walls. Meanwhile, the citizens, consumed by righteous anger, began to seize any available tools made of suitable material, transforming them into improvised weapons. Gathering into an impressive crowd, they moved towards the Praetorian camp, where they fiercely attacked the gates and walls, as if organizing a veritable siege. By the end of the day, the Praetorians, observing the exhaustion of the civilians, decided to retreat. The crowd, believing that the small guard detachments would not dare pursue such a large gathering of people, fled in chaotic disarray. However, the Praetorians immediately flung open their camp gates and swiftly surged in pursuit. In this sudden attack, they slaughtered a significant portion of the crowd. After pursuing the fleeing civilians for only a short distance, the Praetorians returned and securely fortified themselves within the camp walls. Meanwhile, Balbinus issued an edict in which he urged the civilian population to cease aggressive actions against the Praetorians and guaranteed the soldiers full forgiveness, granting them amnesty for all their transgressions. But this diplomatic intervention did not yield the desired result. Daily assaults on the fortifications did not cease. When the crowd of civilians managed to block the water supply to the Praetorian camp, the soldiers fully realized the criticality of their situation. They once again flung open the gates and launched a daring assault against the civilian population, which soon fled in disarray. Some of the citizens, however, climbed onto the roofs of houses and from there hurled tiles and stone fragments down on the guards. The Praetorians suffered significant losses, and seeing that most of the houses were built predominantly of wood, they decided to set the structures on fire. The fire spread with incredible speed, engulfing a continuous, destructive torrent over a significant portion of the great city. The siege of Aquileia and Maximinus's demise. Meanwhile, to the north, events related to the siege of Aquileia unfolded. While the heart of the empire, Rome, was engulfed in flames, Emperor Maximinus was besieging the city of Aquileia. However, it soon became clear that his attempt to take the city was doomed to fail, as his army was in a state of deep discontent. Maximinus launched numerous assaults daily, and his entire army kept the city under tight encirclement, but the residents of Aquileia offered fierce resistance, demonstrating genuine enthusiasm and unwavering will to resist. Maximinus's food supply was rapidly depleting, and his soldiers' morale was plummeting. The soldiers of one of the legions, long stationed in Alba Longa, not far from Rome, had families there. Likely fearing for their safety amidst the raging fire in the capital and the general instability, they decided to revolt against Maximinus. As a result of this rebellion, he was killed along with his son. After the death of their commander, Pupienus ordered his legions to return to their permanent bases. However, he made an unusual decision, to employ Maximinus's German guard into his own service. The use of these foreign guards created the impression that he was aiming for sole power, which, in turn, caused serious concern among the Praetorians. They began to fear that Pupienus might completely replace them by creating a new German guard unit, which, given Rome's extremely unstable situation at the time, could well have been part of his strategic plans. The Aquileians, without delay, opened their city gates, warmly welcoming Pupienus. All of Italy, from one city to another, sent delegations to him, composed of their most prominent citizens. These envoys, clad in white robes and bearing symbolic laurel branches, arrived, bringing with them not only votive offerings but also sacred statues of their ancestral gods, and precious golden crowns. Soon after, Pupienus made his return to Rome. There, Balbinus awaited him, having arrived with the young Gordian Caesar. The Senate and all the Roman people, overwhelmed with jubilation, met Pupienus with equally enthusiastic cheers, as if he were making a triumphal entry into the capital. The fall of Pupienus and Balbinus. In the subsequent period, the two emperors governed with exemplary order and outstanding competence, earning unconditional approval from all sides, both in the private lives of citizens and in state affairs. The people universally revered and deeply respected them, seeing them as true patriots and admirable rulers, standing at the head of a great empire. However, despite the widespread affection, the Praetorians secretly harbored resentment, being extremely annoyed that the people so overtly expressed their support and approval for the new emperors. As the Capitoline Games neared their conclusion, and all the city's inhabitants were engrossed in festive celebrations and spectacular shows, the Praetorians suddenly unleashed their long-suppressed grievances. Making no attempt to curb their escalating anger, they launched a disorderly and senseless assault, swiftly bursting into the imperial palace with a single, sinister goal, to reach the elderly rulers. Remarkably, it was the irreconcilable rivalry between the two august co-emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, that ultimately led to their fatal outcome. Pupienus, who possessed keen political acumen, suddenly realized that the Praetorian Guard, a pillar and simultaneous threat to the emperors, was moving towards them with the unequivocal intention to kill them. He immediately proposed summoning a significant contingent of Germanic auxiliary troops, who were in Rome, to repel the conspirators. However, Balbinus, consumed by suspicion and deep distrust of his co-ruler, obstructed this order. He mistakenly believed that this was merely a cunning ploy devised by Pupienus to deceive him, and knowing the unwavering loyalty of the Germans to Pupienus, Balbinus feared that these troops would be used not to suppress the Praetorian mutiny, but to secure sole power over the empire exclusively for Pupienus. Meanwhile, as soon as news of what was happening in the palace reached the Germanic warriors, they immediately seized their weapons and rushed to the aid of their emperors. But it was already too late. As soon as the Praetorians were informed of their approach, they mercilessly killed both emperors. Pupienus and Balbinus were killed and mutilated, and their bodies, stripped of all dignity, were dragged through the streets from the palace to the Praetorian camp, their lifeless remains left exposed on the street for all to see. Immediately thereafter, the Praetorians seized the young Gordian Caesar and proclaimed him the new emperor of Rome. Reflections. Reflections on these events lead to the following conclusions. The concept of two co-equal emperors, which theoretically seemed a very promising approach to governing the vast Roman Empire, ultimately suffered a crushing failure. The reason lay not only in the insurmountable mutual envy and deep distrust that corroded the relationship between Pupienus and Balbinus, but also in their fatal inability to secure the loyalty and support of the powerful Praetorian Guard. It is worth noting that the concept of divided rule, or diarchy, was not unprecedented for the Roman government. The empire's history knew similar examples. And, paradoxically, it was this model of joint governance that would later become a key element in the strategy for restoring the imperial system and successfully overcoming the deep crisis of the 3rd century that plagued the Roman state.